Why are conscious states inherently effective?
Well, there are two questions in that. The first is the fact that they are inherently effective is only something that we've recently realized. And that's been through the stimulation of those parts of the brain that switch on the lights. We used to think this was just, it made us awake. It was just switching on the volume. And recently we've realized that through stimulation, mainly through stimulation studies, that those structures when you stimulate some of those brain structures that make us awake, some of them make you extremely happy, extremely joyous and pleasurable. In fact, even can give you orgasms just from the stimulation of that part of the brain that we thought just switched on the lights. From the other parts, it makes you feel extreme pain, absolute terror, horrible feelings. You just want to get away from the researcher. So I think that that's the first thing we have to establish, is that conscious states, the most basic conscious states, are affective. Now, the question that you're asking, why should that be the case? Here we have to come to theory. It's a fact that they are affective. The theoretical explanation derives from where those brain structures are. The parts of the brain that switch on the lights, that make us conscious and that do so in an affective way, are also the parts of the brain that monitor and regulate the bodily economy. They're directly in touch with what's going on inside you in terms of basic vital functions, functions which are essential for life and also for reproductive success. These are the things that really count in evolution, in how our bodies are designed. So if you're doing well, if your basic bodily functions are operating in such a way that you're more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce, in other words, you're eating, you're drinking, you're making love, this feels good. If, on the other hand, you're starving, you're thirsty, and nobody wants to sleep with you, this feels bad. And we think that the conscious feelings are there in order for the subject to know, how am I doing within that biological scale of values? What's good, what's bad, what should I do more of, what should I do less of?
So what we call consciousness is really a form of evaluating what is going on with us physically.
Yes, I think it's very important that we must differentiate between different aspects of what we call conscious. I think most people, most of the viewers of this program will think, well, my consciousness is mostly visual. It's got to do with what I see and what I hear. And of course, it's true that we are conscious of what we see and what we hear, and this is where the light shines, and so we think, this is it. This is the contents of my consciousness. What we forget is that it's me that is seeing and hearing. And that me, the subject of consciousness, that me is affective. So there's the feeling of being, of existing. The phenomenal presence of a self is affective. And then that self feels its world. So it's, I feel this about that. The consciousness doesn't come from that. It comes from me, and it extends onto what I'm perceiving. So we mistakenly think that the perceptions are the stuff of consciousness. But really, they're the objects of consciousness. The stuff of consciousness comes from inside.
From the philosophical point of view, the stuff of consciousness seem to be thoughts. But now you're saying it's not thoughts.
Yes, thoughts are derived from perceptions. So I'm saying that, first of all, we have consciousness, which is affect. It's a feeling being, a feeling subjective presence. That feeling subject can sample, can turn its light onto things. So mostly we do that. Most people think of their conscious experience as a turning of their consciousness toward what they're perceiving. But of course, it's also true you can turn your consciousness onto memories of things you've perceived before, and it's from those memory traces that we construct all of our thoughts. Thoughts are, and this is an ancient philosophical tradition, the whole tradition of empiricism from Hume and Locke, already claimed that what ideas are traces of perceptions reassembled in new ways. And from a contemporary cognitive neuroscience point of view, we can show that in the brain with neuroimaging, that when you're thinking something, if you're thinking something visually or you're thinking something auditorily, the same parts of the brain as would activate when you're perceiving those modalities activate when you're thinking about them. So thoughts really are, from my point of view, there are two types of consciousness, broadly speaking. There's consciousness itself, which is affect. And then there are representations which our consciousness projects onto and lights up. Those representations can be percepts or they can be cognitions. They're basically of the same type of stuff, and they're secondary. They are not the primary stuff of consciousness. They're what we're conscious about.
When you talked about the basic physical awareness where, the light comes from, you were talking in terms of physiology about the Hirn stem, right?
Yes.
The brain stem, sorry.
Yes.
Hirnstamm.
Hirnstamm, yeah.
Why is it this part, and don't we share this part with most other mammals and other animals?
Yes. The question, again, is a two-part question. You're saying, why is it the brainstem where consciousness comes from? And the second question is, don't we share that brainstem with most other animals? The second part is a factual question. Yes, we do. We share the brainstem, and the part of the brainstem that generates consciousness we share with all other vertebrates. So we know when vertebrates emerged in evolution. They emerged 525 million years ago. So this means that consciousness is an extremely ancient property. The question as to why it should be associated with those parts of the brain, it has to do with what consciousness is for. What consciousness is for is telling the organism how it's doing within a biological scale of values. Before those structures evolved in the brain, think about it. Imagine you are an animal with no consciousness. And certainly there's good reason to believe there are animals with no consciousness, like, say, for example, an ant. You're an ant. You're anting along, and one of your little feelers bangs into a wall, and there's a rule, an absolute rule, that now I must move 45 degrees this way. And boom, 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 then you bang into another wall. Now I must move half as much this way, and I carry on. Until I bang into something else, then it's 40. So, these are absolute rules. There's no flexibility at all, because these are automatic mechanisms. They're the opposite of what consciousness allows us to do. What consciousness allows you to do is to feel your way through the situation. So you're saying, is this good? Is this bad? What about this? What about this? What about this? This? What about that? What about this? You can try all sorts of things out, and your feelings tell you, is this a good move or is this a bad move? It's an enormous evolutionary adaptive advantage, because for the obvious reason that you can now, no matter what environmental niche you find yourself in, something completely unpredicted by evolution, like suddenly an ice age, or suddenly global warming, or whatever the case may be, you have an inbuilt mechanism for flexibility, for being able to find your place within whatever environment you find yourself. You don't have to have hardwired, pre-programmed rules of what to do. You can work out what to do for yourself. So the answer to the question as to why is it such an ancient function is because once evolution invented this, it's never going to drop it. This is such a good thing. It's so obviously something that has to be conserved, because it gives you this enormous advantage to survive and reproduce. When nature hit upon that 525 years ago, it kept to it. And that part of the brain stem, is the oldest, it's the oldest part of the brain. Everything else that evolved over that, this big forebrain that we're so proud of course, that makes our consciousness very different from that of a lizard or a snake. But nevertheless, we have good reason to believe that lizards and snakes are indeed conscious in the basic affective sense, that they have pleasurable and unpleasurable feelings.
Correct me, but didn't scientists think that the prefrontal brain, for example, was the part of the consciousness? The neocortex is the decisive part, and not the brainstem.
Yes. There's been a major shift over the last 10 years in exactly this respect. And I must also say to you, and through you to your viewers, that not every neuroscientist will agree with what I'm saying. There's a shift busy happening right now. So certainly what you're saying is correct, that the old view was that consciousness was bound up with the prefrontal lobes, which I might point out to you is what is uniquely human. Human beings, it's not only human beings that have prefrontal lobes, but we have the most. We have much more prefrontal lobes than the other primates and the other mammals, and so it's not surprising that we're focusing all of our attention on the prefrontal lobes, and they do have an important function in relation to consciousness, which I'll explain in a moment. The old view was that the contents of consciousness, which we can see from our own common sense, the contents of consciousness are what I see and I hear, and we know that what we see and we hear is registered on the cortex, over here for somatic sensation, over here for vision, over here for hearing, and so on. So there are different parts of the cortex that register different aspects of perception, and then it all comes together in the prefrontal lobes. The prefrontal lobes are a sort of overarching headquarters that monitors what's going on in relation to all the different perceptions. So we thought that is the center for consciousness, if there's any one center. Now, all of that makes sense. The only problem is it's not true. Because if you damage any one of these structures, you lose aspects of consciousness. Even if you damage the frontal lobes, the overarching structure, you lose an aspect of consciousness. So you damage here, you lose auditory consciousness. Damage here, you lose visual consciousness. Damage here, you lose that oversight, but you still have consciousness. Now, you damage all of it. You remove the whole of the forebrain. And of course, we don't do that, but there are children who are born like that, who are born with no forebrain at all. They're called hydranencephalic children. Instead of cortex, they have water. They have cerebrospinal fluid. They have only a brainstem. And these children wake up in the morning and they go to sleep at night. So they have a sleep-waking cycle. They have wakefulness. In the old days, we thought, well, wakefulness is the volume control. It's not the contents of consciousness. The thing that we've realized over the last 10 years, if I can put it facetiously, what we've realized over the last 10 years is that it feels like something to be awake. Wakefulness is not just quantity. It's not just how much am I awake. When you're awake, you feel like something. Feelings don't come through your ears or through your eyes. They are your feelings. So there's a dimension of consciousness that's not related to any aspect of the cortex. In these little children, they don't only wake up and go to sleep, they are very emotional beings. They laugh, they cry, they have little temper tantrums, they get scared, they get frights, they show disgust. All the basic emotions that we know from emotion research are easily demonstrable in these children. And they're appropriately demonstrable. When you irritate them, they get frustrated. When you tickle them, they giggle, and so on. So, and I'm just giving you, because this is a short television program, I can only give you little bits of evidence. But these are the kinds of evidence that have accumulated to show us that consciousness does not require any cortex. The prefrontal cortex does have a specific function in the higher elaborations of the contents, the perceptual contents of consciousness. But all of that stuff has to be activated from below. I've told you that if you damage these different bits of cortex, you lose different aspects of consciousness. But if you damage one piece of the brain stem, called the periaqueductal gray, PAG, it's the size of a jelly bean. It's this big. You damage that piece of your brain stem, lights are out. All consciousness is gone forever. So this is a measure of the difference in terms of what the cortex contributes is different types of information to consciousness. What the brainstem generates is consciousness itself, and consciousness itself is the feeling. And that's what consciousness is for, is so that you can feel your way through your perceptions. We know from robots, for robotic studies, you can do very complicated perceptual things. You can solve very complicated problems if you're a computer, but you're not conscious. You don't need consciousness to perceive and to move and to calculate. We know this not only from artificial intelligence studies, but also from human studies. It's been possible to show over decades now. We've shown that all the gymnastics of cognition, reading, perceiving, recognizing, problem-solving, arithmetic, etc., all of these cognitive things, none of them requires consciousness. So all the things the cortex does not require consciousness. So the question is, what's the consciousness for? What it's for is so that you can work out, how does this feel? Is this good? Is this bad? And you only need to make conscious these cognitive operations when there's uncertainty, when you don't know. Is this a good solution? Is this a bad solution in terms of the basic values of an organism? So this is why many of our cognitive operations, in fact, we're not conscious of them. We automatize them. We do them automatically. This is true. I drive to work from my house to my hospital. I'm not conscious of should I turn left? Should I turn right? Should I change gears? I just do it. Because I know how to do that. These are complicated cognitive operations of all kinds, visual, auditory, problem solving, skilled movement, etc. I don't think about anything. But let them change the road. There's roadworks today, and now the road isn't as I expected. It's like, whoa, now there's a problem. There's a surprise. Then my consciousness gets directed again toward my cognitive and perceptual processes, because now I have to feel my way through this. So it seems that that's what the consciousness is for. The consciousness is for the feeling.
So the whole cognitive world, which we used to think of as being the conscious world, is really the unconscious.
Exactly. As you can see, I'm not a young man. I'm an old dog, and it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. So even I myself have found it very hard to get my head around this. But over these last few years, when my own work has led me to these conclusions, slowly I've come to realize, yes, it is exactly the opposite of what we thought. The perceptual world and the cognition derived from perception, what we're aiming for there is to reduce consciousness. We have this emotion, which is their needs and wants and desires and things going wrong. It's all going wrong. What am I going to do about it? I'll think my way through it. I'll test reality. I'll try to solve problems. I have hypotheses, predictions about how the world works. Slowly I improve them till eventually I find a system that works perfectly. And then I know exactly how to meet my needs in the outside world. At that point, cognition has achieved its aim, which is to reduce all affect and all consciousness to zero. Ironically, therefore, what we're trying to do, we're trying to become like computers. We're trying to become perfect computational devices with no prediction errors. We're trying to become zombies. And fortunately, the world is so unpredictable and so ever-changing that our cognition will never succeed in turning us into computers.
How would you translate the Freudian concept of the id or unconscious to neurophysiological terms?
Okay, now this is a very interesting question as to how you translate Freudian id and ego, es und ich. How do you translate this into modern neurophysiology? That question can be answered in two parts. Firstly, it's very easy. Freud said das Es, it's monitoring the internal economy of the body. It represents the demands of the body on the mind to perform work, because the body has needs, and those needs can only be met in the outside world, and the mind has to find ways of meeting those needs, and it's not easy, because the world's not there to meet your needs. The world is indifferent to you. And what's more, everyone else also wants to meet their needs in that world, and so, it's a competition. So the id represents the state of the body, regulates the state of the body, and sends upwards messages of need, which we call Triebe, drives. Then the ego represents the state of the outside world, first of all through perception, and then secondly through everything we've learned from perception. So the ego is it's our internal model of how reality works. This is our predictions about how reality works based on experience. That's the ego. The id is the demands from the body that send messages to the ego. Here's my problem, solve it for me. And it can always only be solved in the outside world. That's why life is difficult. In terms of trying to locate Freud's ego and id in the tissues of the brain, what's much more difficult than actually doing it, the simple job of finding the anatomical correlates is easily done. What's more difficult is what flows from that. When you do that, you realize that there's a big problem with the Freudian model. Because for Freud, the ego is where consciousness comes from. Ego is derived from perception. Consciousness is derived from perception from the outside world, from the cognitive apparatus of the ego. And the task of psychoanalysis is to drag down this consciousness, these thoughts, this capacity for consciousness, to drag it down to the id, which is intrinsically unconscious. And in this way make the contents of the id thinkable, make it possible for us to know our own inner states. But in fact, as I've told you, the id the part of the brain that performs the functions of the id, not only is it conscious, it's the font of consciousness. It's where all consciousness comes from. Affective consciousness comes bubbling out of the id all the time. So, and the ego is intrinsically unconscious. It only becomes conscious when the id activates it from below. So it is exactly the opposite way around to how Freud thought, which I think has implications for what you're doing when you go to a psychoanalytical treatment or to any talking therapy. The idea that by talking, by finding words to attach to your internal states, you're going to make them conscious. I don't think that's what we do. I think our patients come to psychoanalysis or psychotherapy because they've got feelings that they can't cope with. They've got too much feeling, or they've got feelings that they don't understand, feelings that they can't control, feelings that they don't know how to meet in the world. Guilt, anxiety, desires that they can't manage. And the task of a psychoanalytical treatment, I think, is to manage those feelings, to find the ideas, to find the concepts, to find the ways of being in the world. In other words, cognitive plans, predictions about how the world works. How can I meet my needs in the world? The aim of a psychoanalytical treatment is to find the ideas that can manage the affects. The better ideas you have, and by ideas I don't mean philosophies, I mean really facing the facts of how the world really works, what's really there, and what do I really want, and how can I really match the two to each other. This is what we have to do. And I think a psychoanalytical therapy is therefore not so much about trying to make unconscious things conscious, although that's also a part of it which I can go into if we had time. But I think that the main thing is it's a matter of managing the consciousness, of containing the consciousness, of making the consciousness something that I can cope with, bearing in mind that the consciousness is affect, it's feeling. So patients come to psychological treatments because they're having troubles with their feelings and not because they don't know something.